On a quiet Hogmanay night, Jessie's first footing goes missing, leaving Lochdu uneasy as the new year begins. Hamish Macbeth soon learns that even old traditions can hide dangerous secrets. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? And if you enjoy settling into these Highland mysteries, subscribe and make this part of your nightly ritual. Only 11% are subscribed while 89% aren't. Your support truly means a lot. The drizzle had already soaked through Hamish's jacket by the time he reached the Kirk Hall, and he hated the evening before it even began. Hogmanay and Lochdu always brought out the worst in people. Too much boasting, too much whiskey, too many villagers determined to prove they were not as dull as their neighbours thought. Lugs trailed behind him, ears flat, as if he too expected trouble. Inside, the hall smelled of damp wool and tablet. Jessie Curry towered above the crowd in a hat that looked as if a blackbird had lodged itself on top. She swooped toward him at once. She always managed to find him in a crowd, like a gull spotting chips. Before Hamish could shift away, she planted herself squarely in front of him. "You'll be at my cottage at the Bells, Hamish Macbeth," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut Bannocks. "I'll not be made a fool of. They told me the hotel has found the perfect first foot, a dark, handsome stranger, just what Nessie never managed." Hamish muttered something meant to sound agreeable. All he wanted was his peat fire and a quiet night with Lugs. Jessie's eyes narrowed. "I mean it. You'll witness it. People talk." People always talked in Lochdu. They often talked rubbish, but that never stopped them. Nessie drifted near with a plate of oatcakes. "Showing off again, Jessie?" she said in a falsely sweet voice. It made Hamish wince. Nessie's sweetness always came with a sting. Jessie ignored her and continued boasting until half the hall was sick of hearing about her proper first foot. Hamish tried to slip away, but Mrs. Patel cornered him to complain about the cold in her shop. Then Angus McGregor announced loudly that Jessie had polished her windows just to make the Englishman think she kept a fine home. The sniggers that followed were not subtle. When the bells finally rang, Hamish was well behind schedule. He had been helping Mrs. Ross find her handbag, which she later remembered was under her chair all along. By the time he trudged through the rain toward Jessie's cottage, Lugs trotting uneasily at his side, the village lane was almost deserted. Only a few stragglers lurked near the cottages, eager for gossip. Jessie's voice carried long before Hamish reached her door. She was shouting at Nessie, the sort of shouting that suggested years of stored resentment. "He's been stolen," Jessie cried when she saw Hamish. "My first foot, the tall, dark Englishman. Someone's taken him." Hamish, dripping on her doormat, stared at the little broken whiskey bottle on the step. There was also a thin smear of coal dust, as if someone had dropped a bit of coal and ground it under a heel. No tall Englishman, no anything. "He's likely drunk somewhere," Hamish said. He should have softened it, but he was cold and tired. Jessie drew herself up as if he had slapped her. "Drunk? And you call yourself a sergeant? I told everyone you'd witness the moment. Now look at me, a spectacle." Nessie let out a sniff. "Maybe even the Sassenachs have standards," she said. A few villagers standing nearby burst into laughter, delighted to see Jessie undone. Jessie went white with rage. Hamish wished they would all go home, but wishing never worked in Lochdu. The gossip had already begun. A couple of fishermen muttered that Jessie had imagined the whole thing. Mrs. McLean whispered that Jessie had been desperate for attention. Someone else suggested the Englishman had taken one look at Jessie's hat and bolted. Hamish did not disagree. He bent down to look more closely at the coal dust, but another burst of mocking laughter distracted him. Jessie was now accusing half the village of interfering. "You're jealous, all of you," she cried. "Jealous because I had a proper first foot and you didn't." Hamish straightened up. "Jessie, we'll sort it tomorrow. He's maybe wandered off." "Wandered off," she repeated, "and left his coal and his whiskey. You think I'm daft?" Hamish did not answer. He had learned long ago that arguing with Jessie only prolonged the suffering. He tried to examine the small footprint near the step, but rain had begun to wash it away, leaving a smear of mud and grit. Lugs sniffed the step, then backed off with a small whine. Jessie glared at the dog as if Lugs himself had sabotaged her Hogmanay. Jessie had already been complaining for days that the Kirk clock was running slow again. It was quicker that way. People preferred a story with a tidy conclusion. Mrs. Patel announced that she had not seen any tall strangers at all. Angus McGregor declared that Jessie's first foot idea was embarrassing nonsense. Even Nessie joined in, telling the baker that her sister had always had strange notions. Jessie, hearing this, slammed her shutters so hard the window frame rattled. When Hamish stepped into the shop that afternoon, the gossip was already thick. Someone told him they had seen a dark-haired man down by the pier. Someone else insisted the only dark-haired man around was the electrician from Inverness, who had left days earlier. A tourist said he had heard a scream near Jessie's lane, but when pressed, admitted it might have been a gull. Mrs. Patel folded her arms as Hamish paid for tea he did not need. "It is shameful for the village," she said. "People will think we cannot manage our own traditions." "They think that already," Hamish said. It slipped out before he could stop himself. When he returned to Jessie's cottage, she refused to open the door at first. Eventually she cracked it just wide enough to glare out. "You let me be disgraced," she said. "You, Hamish Macbeth. You said you'd witness it." "I was delayed," Hamish said. "And the man—" "Don't you dare say he was drunk again. You all want to believe I imagined it. But he was here. Someone took him." Hamish felt a faint stir of unease. He did not like being drawn into Jessie's dramas, but the broken bottle and coal dust were real enough. Still, he said, "We'll sort it in time. Go easy." Jessie slammed the door so hard that Luggs gave a startled jump. On the way back to the station, Hamish stopped near the lane and looked again at the fading mark on the step. A small bottle, coal dust, and a missing stranger. Folk would make a meal of it. He stood a moment, rain dripping off his nose. Maybe he had misjudged something. He usually did. But Loch Dhu would talk itself into a frenzy long before he found any answers, and by then the simple Hogmanay muddle might grow teeth. Luggs pressed against his leg, uneasy. Hamish gave the dog a brief scratch. "It'll be another daft village story," he muttered. But the drizzle felt colder than before, and the lane seemed too quiet for Hogmanay. He walked back toward the station, telling himself there was nothing more to it. Yet something small and irritating lodged in his mind, like a pebble in a boot. By the time he reached the door, he knew only one thing for certain. Jessie would never let him forget this night. The trouble began again the moment Hamish stepped out of the station. At first light on New Year's Day was a dull grey smear over Loch Dhu, and the cold seemed to bite harder than usual. Luggs walked close to his leg, ears twitching. The dog always sensed when a day was already bad before it had the chance to become worse. Jessie Curry's voice still rang in Hamish's ears from the night before, sharp and accusing. He should have ignored her entirely, but it was too late for that now. He trudged toward the Tommelcastle Hotel, annoyed at Jessie, annoyed at himself, and annoyed at anyone foolish enough to travel north for Hogmanay. He expected to find the Englishman snoring under an eiderdown, reeking of whiskey. That would have suited everyone fine. But when he stepped into the lobby, Mr. Johnson had the stiff, prim look of a man preparing a formal complaint. "You're late, Sergeant Macbeth," Johnson said. "The matter is already awkward." Hamish blinked at him. "What matter?" "The gentleman, Mr. Andrew Peters. He left before midnight." Johnson's lips tightened. He took the wee parcel of coal and shortbread that Jessie Curry sent, but not his suitcase, or his wallet. Hamish felt a flick of irritation. Folk forget things when there's drink. Johnson did not soften, not when they've paid in advance. Men who vanish leaving money behind are bad for business. Hamish went up to the room and brought the suitcase and wallet back to the station for safekeeping. Hamish wished he had never agreed to look into anything involving Jessie. Johnson's tone was spreading like a stain. A pair of tourists at the desk turned their heads, hungry for gossip. Hamish made a vague note that he'd check the room, though he already knew the suitcase and wallet would still be there, useless and accusing. By the time he left the hotel, Loch Dhu had already caught the scent of scandal. Gossip slithered through the village faster than common sense ever had. At Patel's shop, a crowd gathered as if Jessie's humiliation were a form of entertainment. Jessie marched in, hair wild, voice louder than necessary. "She took him," she announced, pointing at Fiona McLean, the new B&B owner. "Lured him away to make me look a fool." Fiona's eyebrows rose sharply. "I've never taken anything of yours, Jessie, not even your bad ideas." The queue roared with quiet delight. Mrs. Patel pretended to be very busy with the till while leaning forward to hear every word. Someone whispered that a tall figure had been seen near Jessie's lane. Someone else said it must have been a shadow. When Hamish asked who had seen it, the answer changed twice before settling into a mutter about maybe nobody after all. The villagers were enjoying themselves far too much to be helpful. Jessie jabbed a finger at Fiona. "You've always been jealous of me." "Jealous?" Fiona let out a short, cold laugh. "Of what? Your hat?" Hamish stepped between them before Jessie swung the finger at him again. "Enough. The man left the hotel. That's all." Jessie glared. "If you'd come on time last night, none of this would have happened." He didn't bother answering. Anything he said would only travel round Loch Dhu with the usual distortions. Outside Jessie's cottage, the wind slapped at his coat. The broken miniature whiskey bottle still lay on the step. The coal dust had spread in a thin black smear, fed by the damp. A single footprint had half melted into the mud, stretching toward the loch path. Lugg sniffed it, then backed away as if the imprint offended him. Hamish knelt long enough to feel foolish. A footprint, a bottle, coal dust. Hogmanay debris. Nothing more. Jessie's voice echoed in his head, insisting someone stole her first foot. Foolish. Still, the footprint niggled at him. Too neat for a drunk, maybe. He straightened and looked down toward the loch. The water was a dark sheet in the dim morning, shifting slightly. Lugs growled once, a low, unhappy sound, then fell silent. "Daft dog," Hamish said, though he didn't mean it. Back at the station, he forced himself to call Strathbane. Blair's voice came down the line like a slap. "What now, Macbeth? Another lost cat? Or is Jessie wanting you to fetch her a man from the mainland?" Hamish flushed. "It's only a missing visitor. The hotel's worried. I'm checking the matter." "A drunk Englishman wandering off? That's your big case?" Blair snorted. "Stop wasting police time." Hamish should have argued, but didn't. He said instead, "It's just to keep the hotel calm. Nothing formal." "Good," Blair said. "I'd hate to explain to Daviot why you're chasing shadows." When the phone clicked dead, Hamish stared at it for a long moment. He should have logged the report, even as a minor disturbance, but he didn't want Blair sniffing around Loch Dhu. Blair made things worse just by existing. So, Hamish left it unrecorded that morning, on New Year's Day. A small thing, a harmless thing, no reason to trouble anyone. Outside, the drizzle began again, thin and mean. Luggs lay with his chin on his paws, watching Hamish with solemn eyes. Hamish almost wished Jessie had stayed quiet. Now there was a missing man, a shrinking story, and a village already twisting the facts into nonsense. Something was off, but he couldn't put words to it. He rarely could this early in a mess. He pulled down the station blinds. Tomorrow would be another day, and Jessie would still be raging, and the footprint would still be on his mind. And somewhere, a stranger who had promised a first foot was missing. The call came before Hamish had even finished his morning tea, which was already lukewarm and unpleasant. Someone hammered on the station door hard enough to rattle the frame. Luggs lifted his head and gave a low whine, the kind he saved for genuine trouble. Hamish set down the mug, cursing under his breath, and opened the door to find young Alistair McRae standing there, soaked to the skin and shivering. "Dar says you've to come quick," the boy gasped. "It's a body, down by the reeds. He says it's no our folk." That last part was said with the pride of a child repeating something he didn't quite understand. Hamish knew immediately who it must be. Jessie Curry would have her crowing day, though not in any way she wanted. "All right," Hamish said. "Tell your father I'm coming." Alistair ran off. Hamish fetched his coat, which still smelled faintly of peat smoke and wet dog. Luggs paced at the door, uneasy. The dog disliked dead things. He disliked living trouble even more. The sleet hit them sideways as they made their way down the muddy track toward the loch. It wasn't proper snow and not quite rain, just a miserable mixture that made everything look worse than it was. The reeds ahead swayed in the wind like a curtain hiding something grim. Alistair's father stood hunched beside a rock, arms folded, face pinched. "Over there," he said, jerking his chin. His tone suggested Hamish had personally arranged the death. Hamish walked to the edge, boots sinking into the wet ground. At first all he saw was tattered grass and the loch's slow, dark water. Then a pale shape caught his eye, half hidden among the reeds. The hair was blackened with sleet, stuck to the forehead. The face had the frozen stillness of someone who had been cold long before the weather reached him. Luggs whined again, stepping back. Hamish knelt and pushed the reeds aside. The Hogmanay clothes were unmistakable. The dead man's expression was slack, as if he had fallen asleep and forgot to wake. Hogmanae's missing first foot had returned, though far too late to satisfy Jessie Curry. "He slipped and drowned," Hamish said. The words came out sharp, clipped. He didn't want this. Not this early in the year. Not involving strangers who brought their own trouble with them. The crofter looked unconvinced. "Bad luck," he muttered. "Right at New Year. Folk'll say it's a sign." "Happens," Hamish said. "Folk get drunk, paths get slippery." The crofter gave him a look as if Hamish himself had laid the path. The man's son hovered behind him, eyes wide, eager for more than he should see. Hamish told him to keep back. There was a bruise on the dead man's temple, dark, swollen. Hamish touched the skin with a gloved hand. Cold. Solid. He imagined the man stumbling in the dark, hitting a stone, sliding into the water. It was easier than imagining anything else. Easier suited Hamish fine. He stood and walked a few paces away to the nearest phone box, sheltering from the sleet only enough to dial Strathbane. Blair answered, far too alert for someone who did as little real work as possible. "A body," Hamish said in a bored voice, "down by the loch. Tourist, by the look. Slipped and drowned." "Aye," Blair drawled. "Trust your lot to start the year with trouble. I'll come up, don't touch anything. Not that you ever manage much." Blair hung up before Hamish could reply. Hamish stared at the receiver a moment, thinking unkind things that would never make it past his teeth. Back by the loch, the crofter waited stiffly. "You'll want help getting him out?" he asked, though his tone suggested he'd prefer the body stay exactly where it was. "I'll manage," Hamish said. He didn't want any more hands on the man than necessary. With some effort and a great deal of mud, he eased the body onto firmer ground. The bruise was darker now, almost angry-looking, but the rest of the story seemed neat enough for Strathbane. A drunk foreigner, a slippery night, the end. "He'll have folk waiting somewhere," the crofter said. "Folk that'll want to ken why he's dead in our loch." "It's not your loch," Hamish muttered. The man sniffed. "It's close enough." Blair arrived an hour later, bringing Sleet inside with him. Anderson followed, trying to look important and failing. Blair's voice came heavy with disgust even before he reached the body. "Macbeth, you useless streak of misery. Trust you to turn a tidy little drowning into a mess." Hamish folded his arms. "It's tidy enough." He slipped. Blair bent over the body and poked at the bruised temple. "A slip, is it? And what's this then? He smacked himself silly before taking a swim." "Could be a stone," Hamish said. "It happens." "Aye, everything happens in Loch Dhu," Blair sneered. "Folk vanish. Folk drown. Folk waste my time." Anderson nodded as if Blair had quoted scripture. Hamish wasn't in the mood to give Blair anything extra. He didn't mention Jessie's dramatics or the suitcase left untouched. The villagers would twist the tale soon enough. No need to give Strathbane a head start. Blair sniffed around the scene with theatrical irritation. "You're soft on this place, Macbeth. Soft on its stupid traditions. Soft on its lies. The villagers interfere with everything and you let them." Hamish kept his face blank. He was getting used to Blair blaming Loch Dhu for its own existence. While Blair barked at Anderson to take useless notes, Hamish crouched again, eyes flicking to the dead man's wrist. Something metallic glinted under the soaked cuff. An expensive watch. Odd thing to miss when falling into a loch. A slight indent remained on the ring finger too, pale against cold skin. No ring. He nudged the watch back under the cuff before Blair noticed. It was nothing. Likely nothing. Blair didn't deserve clues. He'd only twist them. Lugs trotted forward, sniffing the air, nose wrinkling. Blair spun. Get that great mongrel away from the body. Lugs retreated immediately, tail low. Blair could frighten anything if he tried. "We'll call it accidental drowning," Blair declared loudly as if reading from a script. "But we'll question the villagers. They always hide something." He glared at Hamish. "You've made a shambles already." Hamish said nothing. The cold seeped through his clothes. He wanted the whole scene erased. The bruise gnawed at him, but his mind slipped back to the simple lie. The man fell. That was easier. Blair stomped off toward the crofter, who looked ready to throw him into the loch for free. Anderson trailed behind, scribbling whatever nonsense Blair expected him to. Hamish remained by the reeds, staring down at the pale face. Jessie Curry would be wild when she heard. The village would chew on every detail like a dog with a bone, and Hamish would be left sorting rumour from rubbish. He felt a small, pressing guilt. He had treated the missing man as an annoyance. Now the annoyance lay cold on the mud, and Hamish had said too early and too often that it meant nothing. When the body was finally taken away, the crofter approached again. "Folk'll be talking," he said, as though Hamish needed telling. "New Year death's a bad omen." "For who?" Hamish muttered. "For everyone," the crofter said, and marched off, leaving Hamish to deal with the rest. Back at the station, Blair strutted in as if he owned the place. He dropped himself into Hamish's chair. "You didn't tell me that woman, what's her name, Jessie, was involved." "Involved in what?" Hamish asked. "She had some fool first-footing scheme with the man, and a row about it. Anderson heard it already. This village gossip travels faster than disease." Hamish's face tightened. "It was nothing. She never saw him." "A likely story. She's probably hiding something. They all are." Hamish didn't trust Blair with Jessie. She might be exhausting, but she didn't deserve Blair tearing through her life for sport. "It's a drowning," Hamish said. "Leave it." Blair stood, puffing up. "I'll decide what it is. You've gone soft. You don't log the missing man. You don't chase up the suitcase. You don't check the hotel until forced. What exactly do you do here, Macbeth?" "Keep the peace," Hamish said flatly. "It's not working," Blair snapped. When Blair finally left, slamming the door, Hamish sat heavily by the fire. Lugs crept close and rested a warm head on his knee. Hamish absently scratched behind the dog's ears. The bruise bothered him, not in a dramatic way, just in a steady, nagging fashion. And the missing ring. People didn't lose rings when falling. They lost them when something pulled them off. But the easy explanation sat before him like a stubborn stone. The man slipped. Folk slipped all the time. The loch didn't care who you were. He should have corrected Blair, should have pointed out the bruise, should have said something about the ring mark, should have told the truth instead of the easy lie. But he didn't, because he didn't want Blair digging through Loch Dhu, and he didn't want to admit he might have let something worse than gossip pass him by. He stared at the fire, heat on his face, cold still around his shoulders. The next step would come whether he wanted it or not. Blair's interviews would stir the village like muddy water. Jessie would erupt again. Someone would withhold something vital. Someone would lie. And Hamish felt, with a familiar sinking, that he had already made his first mistake of the case. Hamish knew the day was already ruined the moment he saw the car. It sat outside the station like a glossy southern insult, its paint far too clean for Loch Dhu, and its engine purring in a way that suggested the driver believed money could smooth roads as easily as egos. Lugs gave a soft grumble which was sensible. Nothing good ever came out of a car that shiny. A middle-aged man stepped out first. He had the stiff posture of someone used to giving orders that people obeyed. A woman followed, likely his wife, tight-lipped, shoulders drawn up as if the village air offended her. Then came the youngest, sharp-eyed and composed, her dark coat clinging too smartly to be practical in the damp cold. She closed the car door with a little snap that made Hamish think she disliked noise unless she caused it. "Sergeant Macbeth?" she asked. Not a trace of doubt. She already knew. "That's me," Hamish said, wishing he'd had another cup of tea. "Come inside." In the cramped station office, the three Southerners looked like furniture delivered to the wrong address. Hamish mumbled something about tea. They declined in the manner of people who never drank anything they hadn't chosen themselves. Lugg sat behind Hamish's leg, ears twitching. The younger woman spoke. "I'm Laura Kendall. This is my father and mother. We're here about the man you found in the loch." Hamish nodded. "Aye, the hotel said his name was Andrew Peters." Laura's eyebrows lifted in a neat, precise movement. "You've got the wrong man, Sergeant, or rather, the wrong name." She produced a photograph from her handbag. Clean, crisp, southern money again. The face was unmistakable, alive, smiling, too polished for Hogmanay and Loch Dhu. "That's him," Hamish said reluctantly. "My brother," she replied. "His name was David. He used an alias to avoid attention. A family matter. Private." Her tone suggested Hamish had already overstepped simply by listening. The father cleared his throat loudly. "We were told the police assumed an accident." Hamish felt heat creep up his neck. "The weather's been rough. Folks slip." The mother made a faint sound that might have been disapproval or grief. Hard to tell. Before Hamish could say more, the station door burst open. Blair stomped in, Anderson behind him, both bringing cold air and worse tempers. "What's this then?" Blair barked. "Macbeth holding court with strangers while I do the real work." Hamish wanted the floorboards to swallow him. The Kendalls stiffened. Laura spoke smoothly. "We are here because the sergeant made an error. You have identified my brother under a false name." Blair snorted. "People who use aliases are asking for trouble, usually criminals, likely mixed up in something shady." Laura's eyes flashed, but she didn't rise to the bait. Her father did. "My son was not a criminal." Blair shrugged. "Folk say a lot. Doesn't make it true." Hamish shot Blair a look meant to silence him. It did nothing, of course. Blair only grinned wider. "Macbeth," Blair said, "did you bother checking his luggage, or were you too busy pandering to those daft villagers?" Hamish swallowed his irritation. "I checked. There was a suitcase." Blair strode past him and pulled the case from the corner where Hamish had left it. He popped it open. Clothes, papers, then tucked under a folded jumper, a small velvet ring box. Empty. Hamish hadn't noticed the box before. He cursed himself silently, always one step behind when Blair was in the room. "What's this?" Blair said loudly, as if performing for an unseen audience. Laura's face barely changed, but her eyes flicked to the box, then to Hamish. "He had a ring," she said. "He should have had one, at least." Her father shifted. He was dealing with complicated matters. Blair pounced. "Sounds like trouble to me. Criminals, illicit affairs, debt. Folk don't lose rings unless something's wrong." Hamish felt a familiar tightening in his chest. He hated giving Blair anything resembling a victory, yet he could not deny the missing ring was a problem. Laura straightened her coat. "We would like to see where he was found." "You'll not be traipsing down to the loch," Blair snapped. "Macbeth made enough of a spectacle without you adding to it." Hamish stepped in. "They've come a long way, Blair. We can manage a visit." Blair glared, but allowed it. The loch path turned the Kendalls' expensive shoes into damp liabilities. The father complained twice. The mother said nothing at all. Laura observed everything, the reeds, the mud, Hamish himself, with a coolness that made him uneasy. When they returned to the village, the Kirk Hall was already full. Gossip had travelled faster than the Southerner's car. Someone said a fancy family had come to accuse Jessie Curry of murder. Someone else said Jessie had run away. Neither was true, but truth seldom mattered. Jessie stood in the middle of the hall like a hen guarding an empty nest. Her hair was pinned back ferociously, as if daring anyone to comment. When Laura's father stepped inside, the room hushed. "You," he said, pointing straight at Jessie. "You enticed my son into some drunken ritual. You made a spectacle of him." Jessie's mouth fell open. "I never saw him. Never. I was waiting all night." "A woman of your sort," he began, but Jessie's shrill outrage drowned him out. "You call yourself decent folk, coming into our hall accusing me. I've not harmed a soul." The villagers watched like an audience at a cheap play. Nessie muttered something spiteful about Jessie always wanting attention. Mrs. Patel whispered behind her hand. Fiona McLean smirked from her corner. No one defended Jessie. That was Lochdu, quick to judge, quicker to enjoy someone else's misery. Hamish tried to intervene. "This isn't the place for—" The father cut him off. "If your sergeant had handled things properly, we wouldn't need to confront villagers ourselves." Blair, arriving late on purpose, pushed through the crowd. Macbeth has made a mess again, I see." Hamish ignored him. Instead, he noticed something sharper, Laura's gaze drifting from Mr. Johnson to Fiona McLean, measuring them both, like someone confirming old expectations. A look that said she recognised them, or at least their type. He opened his mouth to ask, but she looked away before he could speak. After the confrontation fizzled into mutters and gossip, Hamish returned to the station. The ring box bothered him. So did Laura's glance at the hotelier and Fiona, and the father's eagerness to blame Jessie instead of anyone else. The phone rang. Daviot's voice buzzed with irritation. "Macbeth, what on earth is happening? Reporters are sniffing around. This is bad press, very bad press. You've mishandled things from the start." Hamish felt the weight settle on him. "We'll sort it, sir." "You'd better," Daviot snapped. "I want results." The line went dead. Hamish rubbed his forehead. Results. He barely had facts, let alone results. The station felt colder than usual. Luggs padded over and laid his head on Hamish's knee, sensing the tension but offering no answers. The velvet ring box still sat open on the desk, empty, accusing. Something was wrong, more wrong than he had realised at first, and now the wrong name was only the beginning. Rain hammered Lochdu hard enough to flatten even the boldest gossip, but it never worked. By morning, the whole village had decided that visitors were drowning in the loch as if it were some greedy southern tourist trap that swallowed folk for fun. Hamish heard the muttering before he even reached the station door. Lugs lingered behind him, fur damp, ears twitching. The dog disliked storms and disliked bad tempers even more. Inside, Fiona McLean was waiting for him, arms folded, face set like a slab of cold stone. She didn't bother with a greeting. "My whole winter trade is gone, Hamish Macbeth," she snapped. "Gone overnight. Cancellations from every direction. The hotel's no better. Folk are saying we lure people up here to drown them." Hamish felt a faint, unwelcome pang of guilt. He tried to put on his calm voice, the one he used when villagers behaved badly. "It's just talk." "Talk?" she repeated. "That Blair tramp stomped all over the place yesterday, asking if strangers are safe in Loch Dhu. He asked the grocer if we sacrifice tourists for good luck. You let him do it." Hamish winced. Blair did have a talent for wrecking livelihoods when bored. "I can speak to him." "Oh, that'll help," Fiona said, rolling her eyes. "You'll speak politely while he ruins us." Before he could answer, Mr. Johnson from the hotel pushed open the door, shaking sleet from his coat. "Macbeth," he said, ignoring Fiona entirely. "I've had 3 telegrams saying guests are choosing Tobermory instead." "Tobermory? They'd rather deal with ferry trouble than your police." Hamish tried not to bristle. It wasn't his loch that drowned the man. It wasn't his fault the dead southerner had fallen, or whatever he'd done. But the villagers were quicker at blaming him than the weather. "What do you want me to do?" Hamish asked, keeping his voice level. "Fix it," Johnson said simply. "I run a respectable hotel." Fiona snorted. "Respectable, aye, except when folk die on the doorstep." Hamish could see disaster brewing in both their eyes. Loch Dhu prided itself on being peaceful and welcoming, even if that peace hid petty rivalries sharper than knives. Now the whole place seemed eager to push the blame around until someone broke under it. "Listen," Hamish said, choosing his words with care. He often chose wrongly. "If the 2 of you just tell folk it was an accident," Fiona exploded. "Hamish, we can't lie like that." "It's not lying," Hamish insisted. "Folk don't like mystery. They panic. You say he'd been drinking heavily, slipped, drowned, they'll believe it. They prefer stories with simple endings." Johnson looked thoughtful at once, which annoyed Hamish more than it should. Fiona looked horrified, which also annoyed him. "But he did drown," Johnson said, "and all that talk about bruises, Blair's fault I'm sure, has done us no good." Fiona glared at Hamish. "And what if it wasn't an accident? You'll have us comforting ourselves with lies while the truth gets worse." Hamish felt his neck heat. "It keeps the peace, for now." Fiona hesitated. Her business was new, fragile. Johnson's was old, but equally fragile under village rumour. "Fine," she said at last, voice flat. "If it saves the winter." She left without another word. Johnson followed, muttering about tourists being delicate creatures. Lugg sat beside Hamish, watching him with the expression of a dog who expected trouble and was rarely disappointed. Hamish rubbed his forehead. The lie didn't sit well, but it sat easier than Blair rummaging through every corner of Loch Dhu accusing people of murder. He didn't get long to think. By midday, Blair burst into the station, Anderson trailing behind like a badly dressed shadow. "So," Blair roared, "you're spreading lies now, Macbeth." Hamish stiffened. "What lies?" "Don't play the innocent." Blair jabbed a thick finger at him. "Trying to hush it up, are you? Telling everyone the dead man was some drunk who couldn't stand on his own 2 feet, covering for your precious village." Hamish felt a pang of dread. Someone had squealed, likely half the village at once. Gossip in Loch Dhu travelled faster than electricity. "I suggested no such thing," Hamish lied smoothly. He'd had practice misdirecting Blair. Folk came to their own conclusions. Blair barked a harsh laugh. "You're not a policeman, Macbeth. You're the village social worker, keeping everyone cosy while the truth rots under your feet." Anderson nodded eagerly, like a dog hoping for a scrap. "Aye, sir, that's what folk are saying." "Shut up, Anderson," Blair snapped. 2 locals who had wandered into the doorway pretended to examine the notice board, but were listening like hawks. Hamish felt humiliation creep into him, slow and mean. He should have expected Blair to turn his attempt at calm into another accusation. "You're on thin ice," Blair growled before stomping out again. Anderson lingered just long enough to give Hamish a look of pity, which was worse than Blair's insults. Hamish retreated into the back room. Lugs followed, tail drooping. but Lochdu wasn't finished with him yet. At the kirk that afternoon, an elder said loudly, "It's Jessie Curry's doing. A woman of her age should ken better than to meddle in first-footing traditions." Jessie stood frozen in the aisle, face blotchy. Nessie hovered behind her, torn between outrage and smugness. "I didn't bring bad luck," Jessie said. "You all did, with your whispering." No one comforted her. That was not the Lochdu way. They liked a spectacle too much. Jessie left in tears, her boots squeaking on the kirk floor. Nessie followed her, shouting at Hamish, "You could have defended her. You know she meant no harm." Hamish stared after them. Defending Jessie rarely worked. It only made her louder. Still, the look Nessie gave him was plain enough. Another villager blaming him for not straightening out the world. He walked back toward the shops, needing cigarettes, though he shouldn't smoke. The sleet had eased, but left the air tasting metallic. Inside Patel's, gossip clung to the shelves like dust. Mrs. Patel rang up his cigarettes and then said, in her usual brisk tone, "There's a letter, a registered one. Your dead man posted it on Hogmanay. No one collected the receipt." Hamish blinked. Where was it sent? "A Glasgow solicitor," she said, flicking her hand. "Legal business. They meddle in everything. Probably wrote his will." She seemed eager to dismiss it. Villagers hated when anything important started outside Lochdu. It disrupted their view that the whole world should revolve around their opinions. Hamish pocketed the thought along with the cigarettes. A registered letter on Hogmanay. Nervous enough to seek legal involvement, it should have made him curious. Instead, clinging to the accident story he'd already helped set in motion, he nodded absently. "Maybe nothing," he said. Mrs. Patel sniffed. "Everything is nothing until it becomes trouble." She had a point. She usually did. Outside, sleet tapped against the shop awning. Luggs leaned against his leg, sensing the shift in his mood, but offering nothing more. Hamish lit a cigarette, though the wind stole half the smoke. He stared down the road toward Jessie's cottage, where he knew she'd be weeping and telling Nessie she was cursed. He had made a bad decision. He could feel it quietly, like a bruise under clothing. But Lochdu had already chosen its story, and changing a villager's mind was harder than solving a crime, especially when he wasn't even sure it was a crime. The registered letter weighed in his pocket, not physically, but in thought. He walked back to the station with a heaviness he didn't like. The lie about the accident might have calmed the businesses for a moment, but it had handed Blair a weapon, and Blair never let go of a weapon. Hamish shut the station door against the cold. Luggs settled beside him. The quiet was thin, uneasy. Tomorrow would bring worse. He could feel it already. The banging on the station door started before Hamish had even opened the morning blinds. It was a hard, impatient pounding, Blair's style, except Blair preferred to kick things. Luggs slunk under the desk, ears flat. Hamish felt the same way. He opened the door to find Anderson, soaked and shivering, holding an envelope as if it might explode. "Post-mortem report, sir," he said, though Hamish was not his sir. Hamish took it, dread already forming. The envelope was thick enough to hold trouble. He tore it open with a thumb that felt suddenly clumsy. One glance was enough. Not drowning. A blow to the head first. Hard, deliberate. He let out a quiet breath. His cosy explanation was dead. Before he could speak, Blair shoved Anderson aside and barged in. "So," he barked, "have you read it, or do you need me to sound out the big words?" Hamish held the report out. Blair snatched it and scanned it, his face brightening with the pleasure of being right. He jabbed a sausage-like finger at the page. "You had a murderer on your hands, Macbeth, and you called it a fool. That's negligence." Hamish flushed. He hated blushing in front of Blair. The bruise looked like a fall. Folk hit their heads. "Save it." Blair folded the report dramatically. "You're always making excuses for these villagers, and now we've a murder because you were half asleep." The phone rang then, shrill and perfectly timed to make everything worse. Hamish picked it up reluctantly. Daviot's clipped voice came down the line. "Macbeth, this is quite the mess you've created. Do you know how this looks?" Hamish stared at the wall. "I misjudged the bruise." "You've misjudged a great many things," Daviot said. "If this reflects poorly on the force, there will be consequences." Hamish murmured something non-committal and hung up. Blair was enjoying himself far too much. "Right then," Blair said. "We start with motives. Who lured him up here? Who made a fuss? That Jessie woman. She wanted her first foot. He refused. She brained him." Hamish blinked. "Jessie?" She can hardly lift her coal bucket." "Women that age are dangerous," Blair said smugly. "Frustration, jealousy, happens all the time." "It does not," Hamish muttered. Blair ignored him. "We'll bring her in. And that McLean woman too. Folk with new businesses always hide something. Probably overcharged him for a scone and panicked." Anderson snorted, eager to agree. Hamish's embarrassment tasted sour. He had made this easier for Blair. Much easier. After Blair stormed out to terrorize the village, Hamish sank onto the station chair. Lugs crept out and nudged Hamish's knee with his nose, sensing the tension. The dog was no help, but Hamish scratched his head out of habit. He needed to see Jessie before Blair got to her. Jessie's cottage looked even smaller than usual that afternoon. Rain slapped the windows like someone impatient to get in. Nessie opened the door before Hamish knocked twice, her expression a mixture of pride and irritation. "Well, Sergeant, come to arrest her," she said. Jessie sat rigidly in her armchair, hands clenched in her lap. Her chin lifted when she saw Hamish, though her eyes were red. "Jessie," Hamish said, "Blair's talking nonsense, but I need to ask." She cut him off. "That man never reached my door. If he'd so much as set foot on my path, I'd have heard it. I told you." Nessie nodded vigorously. "She's right." Jessie was fussing all night, listening for every sound. She'd have leapt at that door like a cat. Jessie shot her a glare. "And you'd have gloated if I'd missed him." "Well," Nessie said, "you were that busy boasting, Jessie. You might have missed a church falling." The sisters glared at each other. Hamish felt a headache forming. "Jessie," he said, "Blair means to name you as a suspect." Jessie went pale. "Me? I never— Hamish, if you let him—" "I'm not letting him," Hamish lied reflexively. "I'm talking to folk before he scares them." Jessie's voice was sharp. "You'd better. That man never came here. Someone else did something." Hamish wanted to believe her. He often believed the wrong people, but Jessie's fear felt real. Nessie hovered, torn between supporting her sister and telling the worst version of events to anyone who would listen. Hamish left them bickering about who would have heard what at midnight. Outside, Lugs whined softly. "Don't start," Hamish muttered. "I'm in enough trouble." Back at the station, he pulled the dead man's clothes from the evidence bag again. He hadn't examined them properly. He'd been too eager to believe the easy story. The trousers had a dusting of peat, not the coarse kind from Jessie's hearth. Finer, darker, maybe from a croft or a business. Hard to say. The jacket had a smear of soot. Not cottage soot. This was sharper smelling, more like something burned from a boiler or a workshop. The Englishman had been somewhere else before, or after, he avoided Jessie's door. Hamish's stomach twisted. He should have noticed before. Blair certainly hadn't. He carried the clothing to the drying rack and stared at it. The clues were faint, but they were clues, and Blair would ignore them entirely. When he stepped out for a cigarette, 2 villagers crossed the street to avoid him. Another pretended not to hear when he said hello. Word had spread. Blair was looking for someone to pin the murder on, and villagers knew that talking to Hamish meant Blair would soon be at their door. Lochdu was closing in, the way it always did when gossip turned sharp. Hamish felt the chill of it. "Great," he muttered, "as if I wasn't far enough behind already." He flicked ash into a puddle and watched it vanish. The vanishing first foot wasn't just a foolish Hogmanay story anymore. It was a killing, and he had started the whole mess at a disadvantage he had largely given himself. Lugs pressed his warm side against Hamish's leg. "Tomorrow will be worse," Hamish said, and he knew it would. The trouble began before Hamish even put on his coat. A raw wind rattled the loose pane in the station window, and Lugs lifted his head with a soft growl. Bad weather always brought bad news to Lochdu. Before Hamish could wonder which villager was about to make his life miserable, Angus McGregor stomped into the station without knocking. "You'll want to speak to young Callum Ross," Angus announced as if delivering the week's gossip with holy authority. "The boy was out on Hogmanay, delivering messages. He saw something." Hamish felt the dull throb of another chore falling onto his shoulders. "Saw what?" Angus shrugged. "Ask him yourself. I've said enough." Then, eager to escape responsibility, he left before Hamish could question him further. Hamish sighed, grabbed his coat, and whistled for Lugs. The dog trotted out, ears twitching toward the wind. The muddy path leading to the Ross Croft looked even longer than usual. Mud sucked at Hamish's boots, and the wind shoved at his back as if hurrying him along. By the time he reached the croft, Lugs' posture had changed. The dog stood rigid, head lifted, nose twitching. A low growl rumbled in him. Not warning exactly, but discomfort. Inside the cottage, voices went suddenly quiet. Hamish knocked. Callum's father opened the door only a crack. He was a broad, weary-looking man who carried suspicion like a badge. "Aye," he said, as though Hamish were a door-to-door salesman. "I've heard your Callum might have seen something on Hogmanay night," Hamish said mildly. The man stiffened. "He saw nothing." Hamish kept his tone even. "Folk say he was delivering messages. Jessie's lane isn't far." The man's eyes darted away. "You ken what Blair's like, we want no trouble." Hamish resisted the urge to sigh. "Let me speak to the lad." "Callum!" the man barked, stepping back only enough to let the boy squeeze forward. Callum was thin, sharp-featured, and looked ready to bolt. Hamish offered a gentler expression. "I'm not Blair. I only want the truth." Callum licked his lips. "I dinna ken if it matters." "Let me decide that," Hamish said, though he wasn't certain he'd know either. After a hesitation, the father jerked his head toward the back room. "Go on then. Quick." Hamish stepped inside. The croft smelled faintly of onions and wet wool. Callum led him to a corner where a kettle hissed on the stove. The boy's voice dropped to a whisper. "I was coming back from Mrs. Fraser's. It was after the bells. Quiet, like everyone had gone inside. Then I saw someone. A tall figure." Hamish felt a tiny prickle of interest. "Where?" "Near Jessie's lane, but not going to her house, walking away, back toward the main road." Hamish frowned. "Carrying anything?" "Aye, a bit of coal, and a bag, like a Hogmanay piece maybe." Hamish tried to picture it. The first-foot gifts were common enough: coal, shortbread, whiskey. But few folk walked the road so late unless visiting someone. "Did you see his face?" Callum shook his head. "Too dark. Could have been the Englishman. Maybe no." He swallowed. "I dinna want trouble, Sergeant." Hamish nodded. "Will you give a statement?" The boy recoiled as if struck. "No. Blair'll twist my words. He'll say I accused Jessie, or Fiona, or you." Hamish had no argument. Blair would twist anything he liked. "We're not getting mixed in it," the father announced, reappearing in the doorway. He placed a large hand on Callum's shoulder. "You've said enough." Hamish tried one last appeal. "A man was killed." "Aye, and look where talking has got Jessie Curry," the father said. "Folk pointing at her like she's a witch. No, we'll keep our peace." The door shut firmly behind Hamish. Luggs snorted in disapproval. Hamish shared the sentiment. He trudged back down the croft path. The wind shoved him sideways. The mud clung like it had an opinion about him. Lochdu had always been a place of tight lips and loose tongues. No one told the police what mattered, but everyone told each other everything that didn't. By the time Hamish reached the village, Callum's story, barely a whisper, had turned into a spectacle. At Patel's shop, Mrs. Fraser claimed the figure had been glowing white like a spirit, though she admitted she hadn't actually been outside. At the post office, a tourist insisted he'd seen a man in a dark coat staring through the window that very night. Mr. Patel corrected him. That had been his own reflection. Outside the kirk, Angus McGregor loudly informed anyone who would listen that the figure had carried a shovel, though Angus hadn't been within a mile of Jessie's lane. Every detail contradicted another, and Hamish felt himself sinking deeper into confusion. Luggs pressed close as Hamish walked through the square. People avoided his eye, not out of fear of him but fear of Blair. Lochdu had decided that talking to Hamish meant inviting trouble to one's doorstep. Blair himself stood outside the kirk hall, scarf flapping, enjoying the villagers' discomfort like a man watching sheep scatter. "Ah, Macbeth," Blair called. "Your tame villagers won't sing for you now, will they?" Hamish ignored him. Blair grinned wider, thinking he'd won something. Hamish retreated toward the station, but a faint memory from Callum's halting whisper tugged at him. The bag, wrapped in dark paper. Not just coal, a parcel, a Hogmanay piece. Jessie had prepared such a parcel, everyone knew that. But who else had? Who else gave first-foot gifts to strangers? He couldn't shake the question. At the station, he laid his coat over the chair and stared at the rain streaking the window. Lochdu felt tight around him, as though the whole place were folding in to hide whatever truth lay beneath. It should have been a simple case. Nothing was ever simple here. Luggs rested his chin on Hamish's foot, eyes worried. Hamish scratched behind his ear and murmured, "A tall man walking away from the lane, not toward it." A wrong direction. A parcel no one admitted to preparing. A witness too frightened to speak again. It was something. Barely. But something. Outside, the wind rattled the station door. Hamish felt the unease settle deeper into him. Tomorrow, Blair would stir the village harder. The lies would get louder. And Hamish would have even less to show for all the tramping about in the mud. He sighed. The silent witness had spoken, and told him almost nothing. Rain had been falling since dawn, a steady, miserable drizzle that turned the streets of Lochdu into a slick mess. Hamish felt as though the whole village had decided to sag under it, himself included. Lugs padded beside him with the slow, damp resignation of a creature who knew things were only going to get worse. Hamish had no plan except to seek something, anything, solid enough to hold on to. That never guaranteed success in Lochdu. He drifted into Patel's shop mostly because it was warm, and partly because half the village seemed to be crammed inside, pretending to buy groceries while actually buying gossip. Mrs. Patel stood behind the counter with her usual air of sharp disapproval, as if daring anyone to ask for credit. The buzz of low voices filled the small shop. Fiona McLean and Mr. Johnson stood near the shelves of tinned soup, speaking in hushed tones. Hamish wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but Fiona's tense whisper floated through the air anyway. We had to get rid of him, before he ruined us. Hamish straightened at once. Lug's ears flicked up. The dog sensed the sudden change in Hamish before Hamish did. Get rid of who? Hamish demanded, stepping toward them. The shop went silent, all heads turning like hens spotting a fox. Fiona flushed a deep pink and pointed stiffly at a scrawny mongrel curled up asleep near the crates. The stray dog, she said. He kept coming round the B&B, scared off a guest. Mr. Johnson nodded eagerly, grateful for the excuse. Yes, the dog, mangy thing. The villagers erupted in delighted titters. Someone near the back snorted loudly. Jessie Curry, lurking near the biscuit shelf with the theatrically tragic air of a woman wronged by the universe, raised her voice. Our great detective at work, she announced. Hamish wanted to sink into the floorboards. He muttered something about checking licensing procedures, pretended he'd come in for tea, grabbed the cheapest box on the shelf, and slammed coins onto the counter. Mrs. Patel accepted them with a sniff, though her eyes held the faintest trace of sympathy. Barely a trace, but more than the villagers ever offered willingly. As Hamish turned to leave, Mrs. Patel cleared her throat. Sergeant, she said, quietly enough that only he heard. He hesitated. I? Mrs. Patel cleared her throat. About that registered letter I already told you about. He was nervous. Sent it on Hogmanay afternoon. He seemed nervous. She leaned a little closer, never one to waste words. Kept asking if it would arrive quickly. Told me, this will settle everything. Hamish felt a small jolt of interest. Where did he send it? To a Glasgow solicitor. They've been involved in matters concerning the Kendall estate for years, she shrugged. Old business. Family business. Family business. Hamish tucked that away. The Kendalls were already tangled in enough secrets. Another strand would not make things easier. Before he could ask more, Mrs. Fraser barged in through the door, dripping rain everywhere, and demanded flour. Mrs. Patel straightened instantly, conversation over. Hamish stepped aside, nearly tripping over the mongrel dog, who had chosen that moment to wander lazily into the aisle and block his path. Fiona smirked. Mind your step, Sergeant. Wouldn't want you accusing him next. More laughter rippled through the shop. Hamish forced his face into a blank mask and left. Lugs followed, tail low, uncertain. Outside, the drizzle felt colder than it had a moment before. Hamish walked without direction until he found himself near the Kirk path. A group of villagers huddled under an awning, eager to share the newest version of the morning's story. He hears murder plots in every shopping list, Nessie Curry told them loudly, as though Hamish were deaf. Last week he thought Mrs. Fraser's missing scones were a coded message. The group cackled. Hamish walked past them without slowing. Lugs growled softly, only once. It was enough to make the group step back a little, though they continued whispering as soon as Hamish was out of earshot, or out of what they assumed was his earshot. He always heard more than villagers expected, mostly things he'd rather not know. Back at the station, Hamish set the pointless box of tea on the desk and leaned both hands on the table. Rain tapped the window like a bored neighbour. Lugs lay down with a heavy sigh. Hamish sifted through the bits of information in his head. A dead man with a missing ring. A registered letter sent in haste. A Hogmanay parcel carried by someone walking the wrong way, and now Fiona muttering about getting rid of him, though only about a dog, or so she claimed. He stared at the dead man's file. There was nothing concrete, only scraps, the kind of scraps that Lochdu happily chewed until they turned into nonsense. He sat on the worn station chair. Lugs shifted and laid his head on Hamish's foot. The dog twitched his ears occasionally, as if hearing things Hamish could not. That unsettled Hamish more than the rain. Night crept in early, wind rattled the windows. Hamish lit the stove, though it only half warmed the room. The village outside grew quiet, except for the loch wind moaning through the telegraph wires. Hamish stared at the glowing stove and thought briefly that maybe Nessie was right. Maybe he was hearing murder in places where there was none. Maybe the man had died by accident, and all of this was Lochdu twisting itself into knots it enjoyed too much. But then he remembered the bruise on the dead man's temple, the missing ring, the nervous letter. Something was wrong, but the path to whatever truth lay beneath seemed to retreat further each time he reached for it. Lugs shifted uneasily again. Hamish rubbed his ear. "Aye, boy," he murmured. "I know, I know." The unanswered questions hung in the quiet like damp clothes refusing to dry, and the longer they hung, the heavier they felt. The day began badly, and showed no promise of improving. Hamish had barely finished scraping the burnt bits off his morning toast when shouting drifted through the damp air. Lugs pricked up his ears, then slunk under the table as if even he wanted no part of it. Hamish stepped outside and saw Blair marching across the square, with Anderson scurrying behind him like a guilty shadow. Ahead of them, Dougie Fraser, the hotel's moody barman, was being hauled by the collar, stumbling as Blair yanked him along. A knot of villagers and a few unlucky tourists had gathered despite the cold drizzle, drawn by the promise of a humiliation. Blair raised his voice the moment he saw Hamish. "Here's your murderer, Macbeth. Thought you'd like to meet him before we take him away." Dougie, pale and furious, spat rainwater from his lips. "I've done nothing! Let me go, you stupid brute!" Blair shoved him forward. "You served that Englishman drinks all night. Plenty of time to see his wallet, eh? Plenty of time to push him into the loch." Anderson murmured, "Makes sense, sir," with the enthusiasm of a man hoping for praise. Hamish walked closer, heat rising in his chest. "There's no evidence against him. None. Serving a man whiskey isn't grounds for arrest." Blair sneered, delighted. "Your delicate sensibilities again. People drowned here, Macbeth. That's bad for business. So we pin it on someone." He tapped Dougie on the shoulder. "This one's as good as any." A ripple of uneasy laughter passed through the crowd. Villagers loved a spectacle when it wasn't aimed at them. Jessie Curry stood near the front, lips pursed in satisfaction, as if Dougie's disgrace somehow vindicated her own troubles. Dougie's mother appeared then, breathless and wild-eyed. "Leave my boy alone," she shouted. "He's daft sometimes, but he's no killer." Blair dismissed her with an irritable wave. "He's coming with us." Hamish stepped forward. "Blair, you know nothing about—" But Blair jabbed a finger in Hamish's chest. "You had your chance, Macbeth. You muddled it. Now let a proper investigation happen." Hamish gritted his teeth. Aware that Daviot tended to believe the last voice he heard, Blair spoke loudly and confidently enough to tilt the whole case in the wrong direction. Tourists watched from the hotel doorway as Anderson cuffed Dougie. Dougie shouted curses until the rain swallowed his voice. Blair shoved him into the back of the Strathbane car with satisfaction. As the vehicle pulled away, the villagers didn't disperse. They lingered, feeding on tension the way Lochdu always did. Hamish turned to walk back to the station, but Jessie stepped into his path. Hamish heard panic in it, Jessie reshaping the story now that blame finally had a face. "Looking shifty." Hamish stared at her. "Jessie, you told me you didn't see anyone." She bristled. "I might have forgotten. It was a troubled night, and you've not helped." Dougie's mother, hearing this, let out a wail. "Lies, Jessie Curry, you wicked woman." She lunged toward Jessie, who shrieked and stumbled behind the Kirk notice board. Two villagers pulled the mother back. Though not very enthusiastically. They wanted the fight, but they wanted plausible deniability more. By evening, the Kirk Hall was packed for a meeting about village reputation. That was what the flyer said. In truth, everyone came to shout at each other. Hamish arrived to find the hall buzzing like a badly tuned radio. Mrs. Henderson declared Dougie harmless. Mr. McNabb insisted he'd always had a temper. Fiona accused Jessie of stirring panic. Jessie accused Fiona of slandering her. Mr. Johnson said the hotel was still receiving cancellations. Mrs. Patel said she was tired of everyone pretending they were innocent. Hamish tried to speak, but every sentence twisted the moment it left his mouth. We need to step back and consider. Oh, he wants us to wait while a murderer runs free. I dinna trust a word he says. He's always covering up for someone. He'll blame the Kirk next. The shouting grew until Hamish wished he'd stayed home and let the village fight itself into exhaustion. Then Elder McLean bellowed, "The only thing that matters is the timing. Who was where when the bells rang?" Several people chimed in with alibis based on hearing the Kirk clock strike midnight. Jessie raised her chin and declared she'd heard the bells clear as day. Hamish frowned. "Jessie, the Kirk clock was running 10 minutes slow on Hogmanay. Mr. Ross was fixing it the next morning. You told me so yourself." He hadn't forgotten her complaint that the village couldn't keep time even for the new year. A silence fell like a weight. Several villagers exchanged uneasy glances. If the bells had rung at the wrong time, half the village's alibis didn't fit anymore. People could have been on the lane, the loch path, or the main road without realizing it. The hall erupted again, louder, more desperate. Hamish stepped back, overwhelmed. Luggs, who had slipped in behind him, whined softly as if embarrassed for the whole room. Blair chose that moment to reappear, looking smug and self-satisfied. "We're done here," he announced. "Dougie Fraser is being taken to Strathbane. Let the courts sort the truth out." Hamish stared at him. "You don't have the truth. You barely have a theory." Blair smirked. "Oh, I've got enough, and I've got the support of my superiors." He raised his voice for the crowd. "Macbeth can join us when he stops coddling murderers." He left to approving murmurs from villagers who simply wanted an end to the drama, even if it was the wrong end. Hamish walked home with the weight of defeat hanging on him. He hadn't defended Dougie properly, not loudly enough, not boldly enough. He'd told himself he would find proof of the man's innocence before things went too far, and instead Blair had swept in and dragged the boy away like a trophy. Another misjudgment, another step behind. Back at the station, the lights flickered in the wind. Luggs settled heavily at Hamish's feet, eyes worried. Hamish stared at the empty desk across from him, where the paperwork he hated so much sat untouched. Somewhere in Strathbane, Dougie Fraser was spending the night in a cell. Hamish had let Blair get ahead of him again, and the truth, whatever it was, felt further away than ever. Hamish knew the day was doomed the moment he looked at the suit hanging limply from the back of the chair. It was his least shabby one, which meant it was still shabby, and he doubted it would impress anyone at Tommel Castle. Luggs watched him struggle with the tie, giving a small huff of disapproval every few seconds. Hamish couldn't blame him. He felt foolish. When he finally stepped outside with the bicycle, the cold bit straight through the suit. Luggs trotted beside him, ears back. The road to the castle was slick with thin frost, and Hamish's tyres skidded twice before he reached the long drive. Bright windows glowed through the trees, making the place look far too warm and welcoming, for everyone except him. As they approached the entrance, a footman stopped them with a raised hand. "Dogs not permitted inside, Sergeant." Hamish glanced at Luggs, who stared mournfully at the doorway. "Stay there," Hamish murmured, pointing to a shrub that offered no shelter from anything. Luggs sat beneath it anyway, giving Hamish an accusing look as he trudged into a world where he never quite fit. Inside, Tommel Castle felt smug. Warm lights, clinking glasses, and guests gliding around as though the floor were made of velvet. Hamish tugged at his collar. His suit felt tighter with every step. Priscilla was the first to greet him. "Hamish," she said with perfect politeness, her expression cool. "I hear Loch Dhu is back in the papers. Again." He winced. "Aye, not by choice." Her father joined them, face red with irritation. "Murders and drownings," he grumbled. "Bad for the hotel. Bad for the region. You really must get things under control." Hamish murmured something non-committal. The elder Halberton Smythes never understood that he had fewer resources than their laundry room. A tray of sandwiches appeared, carried by a young waiter who looked terrified of spilling one. Hamish nearly grabbed two at once but stopped himself. Priscilla's raised eyebrow was enough. Laura Kendall approached then, composed despite the house party's noise. She nodded toward a quiet corner. Hamish followed, grateful for the escape. "My brother," she said without ceremony, "was investigating irregularities in an old inheritance, land matters. Something connected to property near your village. Hamish straightened. What kind of irregularities? I don't know the details. Her mouth tightened. He found something he felt he shouldn't ignore. Someone else apparently felt he shouldn't continue. A sleek businessman, hovering near the conversation with the ease of a man accustomed to inserting himself where he wasn't wanted, chimed in. If he was stirring up old ghosts, I'm not surprised someone wanted him quiet. Hamish shot him a sharp look. You knew him? Met him once, the man said casually. He asked too many questions, makes enemies, that sort. Laura cut him off with a soft, icy thank you, dismissing him. Hamish turned back to her. Anything you can tell me? She shook her head. Not now. And Sergeant, please don't mention this to Mr. Blair. Not yet. He's the type to kick in a door before asking who lives there. Hamish frowned. It's police business. It's also legal business, she said. Private, sensitive. If Blair barges in shouting accusations, he'll do more harm than good. Hamish hesitated. He knew she wasn't wrong. Blair approached everything with the grace of a bull in an antique shop. Still, keeping information from Strathbane never ended well. Before he could decide, Priscilla approached again, her expression thoughtful. You look tired, Hamish, she said. You could have been in Inverness by now. You could have had a proper career, not whatever this is. Her gaze flicked over his ill-fitting suit and the glass of cheap punch in his hand. Hamish swallowed the defensive reply rising in him. I'm doing my job, he said. You're burying yourself in village dramas, she replied softly. You're better than this. It hit harder than it should have. He didn't show it, but the words lodged beneath his ribs like a small, sharp stone. Trying to recover dignity, he straightened. I'm close to tying it all together, he said. Too quickly, too firmly. Pride drove the words out, not certainty. Priscilla gave him a faint, unreadable smile. I hope so. Laura seized on the claim at once. Then you'll understand why discretion is vital. You won't mention the inheritance irregularities. Not yet. Hamish nodded, too fast again. I'll sort it first. His face burned as soon as he said it. He was letting social pressure steer him again. Priscilla's disappointment, Laura's cool expectation, Blair's looming incompetence, they all pushed him into a corner he had stepped into willingly. He stayed only a short while longer. Every elegant laugh, every polished shoe, every clink of crystal reminded him he didn't belong there. He slipped out through a side door, grateful for the cold air hitting his face. Luggs scrambled out from under the shrub, shaking off damp leaves, and pressed against Hamish's legs as if rescuing him. Aye, it's a daft world in there, Hamish muttered. The wind cut across the castle drive with a fierceness that felt almost cleansing. Hamish walked the bicycle down the path while Luggs padded close, glancing up now and then as if checking that Hamish was still upright. He had one new clue, an inheritance matter tied to the village. But he'd also made promises he shouldn't have, withheld things he should report, and let pride push him into pretending he understood more than he did. Close to tying it all together, he said bitterly under his breath. Luggs gave a small whine, as if agreeing that Hamish was talking nonsense. The cold wind followed them all the way down the road to Loch Dhu. The closer they came, the more uneasy Hamish felt. He sensed he had just stepped sideways in the investigation rather than forward, and that the cost of that misstep would not stay quiet for long. Hamish knew something was already wrong when the morning train to Strathbane lurched forward with a rattle that made even Luggs flinch. The dog pressed his nose to the carriage window, whining softly as the landscape blurred past. Hamish wished he could leave Luggs behind, but leaving him in Loch Dhu with Blair on the loose felt worse. At least on the train, Luggs could sit beside him and judge him silently like everyone else. Strathbane looked as filthy and unfriendly as ever. Hamish stepped onto the platform and immediately regretted the whole plan. The air tasted of soot. The streets looked as though no one had bothered to scrub them since last winter. People shoved past one another with the glazed indifference of city folk who believed their misery was more important than anyone else's. Hamish trudged toward the solicitor's office, Luggs keeping close as though the pavement might swallow them both. When he reached the building, a grim block of stone with windows that hadn't been cleaned this decade, he felt his resolve sag. But he pushed the door open anyway. Inside sat a clerk who looked like he'd been born to disappoint people. His hair was thinning in a sad way, and his eyes darted around the room as if expecting responsibility to jump him from behind. "Yes?" the clerk asked, sounding exhausted already. I'm Sergeant Hamish Macbeth, Hamish said. Lochdu Police. I'm here about papers sent by a David Kendall, sent on Hogmanay. The clerk fiddled with a stack of envelopes. We received something, yes, but I can't show you anything without proper authorization. I'm the police, Hamish said, trying not to sound irritated. You're a police, the clerk corrected, not our police. Authorization must come from someone above you, Strathbane or Glasgow headquarters. Hamish felt heat creep up his neck. Luggs released a small growl, sensing his rising embarrassment. The clerk flapped his hands nervously. All I can say, he muttered, is that the papers hinted at an old dispute. Land near your village, coastal property, that's all. Now please, don't make this harder. Hamish left before he said something undignified. The clerk's uselessness gnawed at him as he trudged between city offices, hoping someone else might be more helpful. No one was. He spent hours chasing shadows, records, and vaguely annoyed clerks. By early afternoon, he felt as though he'd accomplished nothing except wearing down the soles of his boots and whatever pride he still had. Back at Strathbane Police Headquarters, his day got worse. The moment he stepped into the corridor, Blair's triumphant voice boomed down it. Well, if it isn't Macbeth! Playing detective in the big city, are we? Anderson popped up beside Blair, grinning like a child who'd been handed sweets. Aye, sir. Village policemen out of their depth. Hamish's jaw tightened. I came to look into relevant documents. Something you could have done yourself. Blair snorted. Documents? Nobody solves crimes with paperwork. You've abandoned your witnesses back home while I do the real work. Hamish felt a stab of panic. What did you do? What you couldn't, Blair replied smugly. I questioned the Curry sisters properly. Hamish didn't trust himself to speak. Instead, he left with Luggs trotting anxiously behind him. The train back to Lochdu seemed even slower than usual, dragging every second like a punishment. When he reached the village, Jessie Curry was standing outside Patel's shop, arms folded and face thunderous. Nessie hovered behind her, looking oddly triumphant. Jessie marched up to Hamish. How dare you leave us with that brute Blair? He badgered me for an hour. Now folk think I've changed my story. Hamish raised both hands. Jessie, calm down. I will not calm down, she shrilled. I told him I saw nothing, but maybe I heard something after the bells. Or maybe I dreamt it. And Nessie is telling everyone I was indoors the entire night. Nessie inserted herself neatly. Well, you were, as I recall it. Jessie spun on her sister. You recall nothing accurately. You barely recall where your own front door is. That's rich, Nessie snapped, coming from a woman who's lost her mind over first footing. A small crowd gathered instantly. Lochdu had never missed an argument worth overhearing. Mrs. Fraser whispered loudly that guilt made people quarrel. Mr. Henderson nodded solemnly as if he understood guilt personally, though he did not. Jessie pointed at Hamish. If Blair arrests me, it's on your head. You left us. She stormed off before he could answer. Nessie, smelling victory, hurried after her. Hamish stood in the drizzle, feeling like someone had replaced his insides with wet laundry. The villagers began muttering among themselves. Well, he shouldn't have run off to Strathbane. Macbeth's lost the thread entirely. He can't manage his own village, far less a murder. Hamish tried to tune them out. Luggs stood close, reading every shift in his mood. That evening, in the fading light, Hamish went to the kirk to check the elders' records. Someone mentioned, almost casually, that the coastal land in question had once belonged to a local family, one who now lived quietly in the village under a new name, a name tied to the kirk elders. Hamish straightened. Who? But the villager only shrugged. Folk change names, marriages, old debts. Who can keep track? Hamish hated evasions, yet Lochdu excelled at them. Everyone knew something but said nothing clearly. And after a day in Strathbane chasing legal tangles instead of the movements on Hogmanay night, he felt no closer to understanding anything. He walked back to the station slowly, Luggs beside him. The dog paused once, sniffing at a dark corner as if something troubled him, but then moved on. Inside the station, the silence pressed in. Hamish sat heavily at his desk. He had gone to chase a theory about inheritance and fraud, a grand story that made him feel like a proper detective. And what had it earned him? Blair free to bully the villagers, Jessie's story ruined, Nessie's smugness amplified, new suspicions swirling everywhere, and nothing solid to hold on to. He rubbed his forehead. A fool's day, he muttered. Luggs nosed his knee gently but offered no comfort, only his quiet presence. Outside, the wind rattled the loose pane again. Hamish felt the uneasiness settle deep. Tomorrow, he would need to pick up the trail again. But tonight, he sat in the dim station, knowing he'd let the trail drift further from him. Before Hamish even reached the Curry sisters' cottage, he knew something was wrong. Luggs kept stopping, glancing back, uneasy in a way that made Hamish's stomach tighten. By the time the cottage came into view, the reason was clear. Blair's patrol van sat outside, its doors flung open, and 2 uniformed officers were tramping in and out like they owned the place. Hamish quickened his pace. "What are you doing?" he demanded, but one constable brushed past him holding an armful of old blankets, smelling faintly of camphor. Inside, the tiny cottage looked as though a storm had blown through it. Drawers were yanked open, the contents spilled, and the little parlour carpet was barely visible beneath scattered papers and clothes. Jessie stood stiffly against the wall, her hands clenched at her sides, cheeks red with fury and humiliation. Nessie hovered in the doorway, eyes brimming, shaking her head as though this must be some dream gone badly wrong. Blair stood in the centre of it all, smiling like a cat that had found the cream. "Routine search," he said, "looking for the missing ring. You've had trouble finding real evidence, Macbeth, so I thought I'd lend a professional hand." Hamish's jaw tightened. "You had no cause to tear the place apart." "I have cause," Blair said. 2 women with conflicting stories, a dead Englishman sniffing around their past. And now, he stooped, picking up a small leather-bound Bible that had fallen split-spined on the floor. A bit of family history. "Put that down," Jessie snapped, her voice shaking. But Blair opened it anyway. Yellowed papers fluttered loose, old letters written in faded, cramped handwriting. Anderson, eager as always to please, snatched up one of the letters and read aloud without waiting. "Signed over, coastal parcel, payment accepted, family Fraser to receive title after settlement." Jessie shut her eyes. Nessie made a small choking sound and dropped to her knees among the papers. Blair raised his eyebrows. "Well, well, looks like de Curry wasn't the saint you two like to pretend. And here's more. Mention of a Kendall inquiry." He held up another paper triumphantly. "Seems somebody in this village wanted to keep a land deal quiet enough to pay for it." The murmurs from the doorway told Hamish the worst. Villagers had gathered, as villagers in Lochdu always did. Mrs. Fraser clucked her tongue. Mr. Henderson shook his head gravely. Someone whispered, "I kent it. Always trouble with that family." Hamish stepped forward. "Enough," he said. "The ring isn't here. You've made your point." But Blair wasn't finished. "I'll make the point I like. Folk keep secrets in this village. The dead man came sniffing after old scandals, and look where it got him." Jessie finally broke. She rounded on Hamish with a fury that startled even Luggs, who let out a soft whine. "You let him in," she hissed. "You let him tear our lives open just to make yourself look important." Hamish wanted to protest, but the words stuck. He had tried to stop Blair earlier, but not forcefully enough, and Jessie would never believe that distinction now. Blair signalled his men. "Take what looks useful, leave the rest. Macbeth can sweep up after us." Then he marched out, pushing past the villagers, who backed away politely but with hungry eyes. Nothing delighted Lochdu more than a scandal that wasn't theirs. When the officers were gone, Jessie knelt among the papers, trying shakily to gather them. "Da made mistakes," she whispered. "Everybody's made mistakes in those days, but no one else gets dragged through it." Hamish crouched beside her, picking up a torn scrap. It held only a few words, but enough. Kendall inquiry, payment to settle matter quietly, coastal boundary. A link, real and ugly, tying the dead man's investigation to the sisters' family past. Exactly the kind of thing Blair wanted to weaponize. But it also meant the sisters weren't lying about being part of something they didn't fully understand. Jessie snatched the paper from Hamish's hand. "Don't pretend you're helping. The whole village will ken by tea time. You've ruined us." "No," Hamish said quietly. "Blair ruined you." She gave a bitter laugh. "Same thing." He left them then, knowing anything he said next would make it worse. Outside, the villagers avoided his gaze in a way they rarely did. Mrs. Fraser hurried across the lane. Mr. McLean pretended to study a crack in the pavement. Gossip had already grown legs. Hamish walked toward the kirk, Luggs pressing close, ears low. A session meeting was underway, voices drifting out in clipped tones. He stepped inside just in time to hear Elder Macpherson, who had benefited from the old land deal, say, For the good of Lochdu, we ought to forget ancient quarrels. Outsiders bring trouble, stirring up what was laid to rest decades ago. Another elder nodded. The curry lass should have kept quiet, drawing strangers with all that first-footing nonsense. Hamish felt a stab of anger. Jessie didn't draw anyone, he said, and forgetting doesn't make truth go away. The elders glanced at him with carefully blank expressions, the kind used to dismiss a child without saying so. Macpherson folded his hands. We want peace, Sergeant, the kind your involvement hasn't encouraged. It was as close as they could come to calling him the problem, without risking rudeness. Hamish turned on his heel and left. Respectability mattered more to them than justice. It always had. The drizzle had thickened by the time he made his way back down the hill. Lochdu seemed smaller than usual, the windows shuttered, the paths empty. People peered from behind curtains but didn't open their doors. Lugs bumped against his leg again, sensing the weight in him. "Not now, boy," Hamish muttered. "Folk have made up their minds." He reached the station without meeting a single welcoming face. Jessie was disgraced. The village wanted the scandal buried. Blair had ammunition, and Hamish, yet again, had let events run ahead of him. He sat down heavily at his desk, hearing the faint rattle of the rain against the window. Somewhere out there, someone had killed an Englishman to keep old deeds quiet, and Lochdu, his own village, was ready to let the wrong person burn for it. Before Hamish even sat down, he knew something was wrong. The fire refused to draw properly, sending little puffs of smoke back into the room. Lugs shifted on the rug, uneasy, as though the smoke itself carried bad news. Hamish prodded the peat with unnecessary force, watching it crumble. It suited his mood. Nothing in Lochdu seemed to hold its shape these days. He tried to think in a straight line, a task that felt oddly difficult with the village muttering against him and Blair marching about like a man who had solved everything. He forced himself to list nothing, only to lay the pieces down in his mind. A man leaves a hotel on Hogmanay with coal and a bit of shortbread. He means to go to Jessie's lane. He does not reach it. Someone meets him first. Someone strong enough or angry enough to deliver a blow that kills him before the water ever touches him. Someone who knows the village routes and the quiet corners. Hamish frowned. Jessie's peat dust was coarse and old. The soot on the dead man's trousers was finer, almost greasy, a commercial supply. And Callum had seen a figure walking away from Jessie's lane, not toward it. He had been so intent on chasing legal business in Strathbane that he had ignored the simple path the dead man must have taken. Lugs whined. Hamish stood. I ken," he said. "Enough sitting. We're getting nowhere." He stepped outside into the raw night. The wind slapped at him, sharp and joyless. Lochdu lay dim, half the windows dark, the rest lit with the small glow of homes where people pretended nothing was amiss. He headed for the loch path, Lugs trailing close, as though the dog feared the village would swallow Hamish whole if he lagged. He made for the old boathouse. Most folk pretended it wasn't there anymore except when summer tourists asked about fishing gear. The door creaked when he pushed it, and dust drifted down, catching what little light filtered through the cracked pane. Inside, the air was chill and stale, carrying a faint scent of old ropes and damp boards. Lugs sniffed once, then backed against Hamish's leg. The dog's ears flattened. Hamish felt a prickle at the back of his neck. Not fear exactly, but the sense of something used recently for a purpose it shouldn't have been. He moved deeper into the shadows. His foot disturbed a patch of dust, and he crouched to look closely. Footprints. Fresh enough. Not many, but clear. A man, likely wearing heavy boots. He straightened and reached out to a beam that had caught his eye. There, smeared faintly along the rough wood, was a dark mark, at the height of a man's temple. "Blood, or something like it," he murmured. The blow might have landed here first, killing the Englishman before he ever saw the loch. Lugs whimpered. Hamish gave the beam a long look. He had been wrong about a great deal. Wrong to think Jessie was the intended first foot at all. Wrong to let Blair run ahead with a tidy story when nothing in Lochdu was ever tidy. He poked around the corner. A bucket stood half full of coal, the fine, almost powdery kind that came from the commercial supplier who served half the businesses along the coast. It was the same fine commercial coal Mrs. Fraser kept for the post office backroom stove. Later, back at the post office, Hamish asked to see the backroom stove. Mrs. Fraser protested too quickly. He lifted the coal scuttle lid and, half buried in the fine black dust, Something glinted. A ring. Not crofts, not cottages, larger places with boilers, and back rooms that needed quick heat. Mrs. Fraser's voice drifted through Hamish's memory, her shrill insistence that she had seen nothing, absolutely nothing, on Hogmanay night. Too loud, too eager. Her husband had worked the disputed coastal land years ago, before that quiet sale that had slipped through the hands of the Curry sisters' father. It tied their families to the very scandal the dead man had been digging into. Hamish thought of the registered letter sent from Patel's shop, of the missing ring, of Laura Kendall's flat, careful expression when speaking of her brother, of how fast the village had pounced on Jessie, because Jessie was easy to blame, and Blair needed someone easy. He blew out a breath. The sound echoed strangely in the empty space. "So, it was never Jessie," he said. "You were never meant to go near her door." The Englishman had been diverted, pulled off his first footing route, brought here, struck before he could shout for help, and then dumped in the loch like a nuisance. Hamish felt something unpleasant settle in him. He had let himself chase shadows in Strathbane, searching for legal clarity in a world that rarely offered it. Meanwhile, a very ordinary, very local murderer had taken comfort in his distraction. He stepped back outside. The door gave a weary groan as it shut. The night was colder now, or maybe it was only his thoughts. As he walked, he tried to imagine Mrs. Fraser lying. It was not difficult. She had always been sharp-tongued, proud of her place at the post office window, and too invested in being the village's source of minor authority. Her husband was quiet, the kind of man who hid his temper behind silence. Together, they had enough reason to bury an old mistake rather than let some Englishman haul it into the light. But imagination was not proof. Blair would want a neat story, and Hamish had nothing but soot, coal dust, and shadows on a beam. Lugs pressed close again, lending warmth without meaning to. Hamish gave him a brief rub between the ears. "You're the only sensible one left in Loch Dhu," he muttered. Streetlights flickered across the wet path. A figure hurried by on the opposite side, head down, pretending not to see him. Another stepped out of the way, giving him that sidelong look Loch Dhu favoured when choosing sides, and not his. He reached the station feeling older than he should have. Inside, the air was warmer, but not welcoming. He sat heavily, the peat fire still sulking in the grate as though it resented being disturbed. The truth was taking shape, but it was brittle, easy for Blair to crush, easy for the village to ignore, and Dougie Fraser was still sitting in Strathbane, locked up for a crime he had not committed. Hamish stared at the fire until it blurred. He had chased the wrong paths, clung to the wrong explanations, and let real clues gather dust. Now he would have to put it all right. Somehow. Luggs lifted his head, ears pricking toward the window, as if hearing footsteps in the dark. Hamish didn't move. Tomorrow would bring another storm, made by people, not weather. And he was still standing in the middle of it, without shelter. The Kirk Hall was already too warm when Hamish stepped inside, which meant something was wrong. Mrs. Fraser had charge of the heating, and she never allowed it to rise above the level of mild discomfort. Tonight the radiators hissed like kettles left too long, and villagers were peeling off coats, muttering at the unexpected heat. Luggs nosed the doorway, sniffed the air, and whined. Hamish felt much the same. Villagers drifted in with the stiff wariness of people expecting trouble disguised as community spirit. Jessie came early, back straight, chin higher than usual, dressed as though the entire thing were beneath her. Nessie hovered behind her sister, pale and watchful. At the far side, Mrs. Fraser banged cups about, protesting loudly that she had handfuls of work and no patience for reenacting nonsense. Hamish cleared his throat. No one stopped talking. He tried again, louder. At last the murmuring faded. "Right," he said. "We're here to set things straight. Nothing more." A few villagers exchanged doubtful looks. They didn't believe that for a moment, but curiosity had them by the throat. The cold night outside had driven everyone indoors, where warmth and gossip made an uneasy mixture. "I want a tall volunteer," Hamish said. "Someone to walk the route our first foot should have taken." It came out awkwardly, but that suited him. A polished speech would only have raised suspicion. Johnson from the hotel stepped forward, lanky enough to serve. He clearly enjoyed being the centre of mild attention. Hamish directed him toward the door. "Walk from the hotel to Jessie's lane, slow enough for folk to watch, then down toward the boathouse. That's all." Jessie flushed at the mention of her lane. Someone sniggered. Nessie elbowed them sharply, though her face was tight with worry. When the door closed behind Johnson, Hamish turned back to the crowd. He felt every gaze on him, some sharp, some bored, most waiting for him to stumble. "You all ken the trouble Lochdu's seen," he said, "and the wrong folk blamed." His eyes landed on Dougie Fraser's mother, who looked away as though the floor were suddenly fascinating. Hamish lifted a small paper packet from his pocket. Inside was the dead man's ring. The metal glinted even under the harsh kirk lights. A collective murmur rose. Mrs. Fraser froze behind the urns. "This," Hamish said, "turned up in a coal scuttle behind the post office stove." His tone stayed mild. "Funny place for a ring belonging to a man who never reached the post office that night." Mrs. Fraser straightened, shoulders rigid. "Folk drop things," she said, too quickly. "Folk lose things. It proves nothing." "Maybe," Hamish said. "Except the soot on the dead man's clothing came from commercial coal, same as the coal you keep for the back room." He let that settle. It settled badly. Villagers shifted. A few exchanged guilty glances. They knew, or they suspected. They just preferred not to say until someone else said it first. Jessie folded her arms, brittle as glass. "Are you telling us I'm telling you," Hamish cut in, "that the man never meant to reach your cottage. Someone he trusted diverted him. Someone who handed out registered letters and advice with the same sharp tongue." Mrs. Fraser gripped the tea urn so hard her knuckles whitened. "You'll watch yourself, Sergeant," she snapped. "You've embarrassed this village enough." "That the same village whose clock ran 10 minutes slow?" Hamish asked, and muddled half its memories. Convenient thing for a killer. A rustle ran through the hall. Blair, arriving late and smelling of whiskey and irritation, pushed through the crowd. "What's this circus, Macbeth?" "Grandstanding. I'll handle this." "You tried," Hamish said quietly. He didn't look at Blair. He didn't need to. "But you were looking at the wrong folk." The door creaked. Johnson returned, cheeks pink from the cold. "Walked it, Sergeant. Folk saw me the whole way." "Aye," Hamish said, "just as they saw the Englishman. That's why someone intercepted him before Jessie's path. Someone waiting near the boathouse. Someone who panicked when he mentioned reopening the land deal that made certain families comfortable." Mrs. Fraser's face drained. For a woman usually bursting with colour and noise, the silence she offered now was startling. "My father did nothing wrong," she said through stiff lips. "He made a deal," Hamish replied. "A quiet one, and your family enjoyed the benefits. When the Kendalls began looking into it again, you heard enough through the post office window to become worried." Blair shoved forward. "You've no right, Macbeth. No evidence. You're embarrassing the constabulary." No one moved aside for him. That alone made Blair's face grow mottled. Hamish gestured toward the ring. "She took his ring when he fell, or when she hit him, maybe to make it look like theft, maybe by accident." He paused. "But she threw it in her own coal scuttle. Folk don't hide things well when they're shaking." Mrs. Fraser's breath rattled, harsh and uneven. "You think you can prove a thing like that? You, with your sloppy ways and your dog underfoot?" Hamish didn't answer. He waited. The villagers watched her. Their silence became a heavy thing, pressing inward. It was the silence of people realizing they had protected the wrong party and were now eager to distance themselves. Mrs. Fraser buckled first. She didn't weep. She didn't shout. Her voice came out flat and furious. "He shouldn't have come here," she muttered. "Digging up rubbish better left buried. I only meant to frighten him. He grabbed my arm. I struck back. He fell. It was dark. I panicked." Blair surged forward triumphantly. "I knew it. Proper procedures from here, Macbeth. You've interfered more than enough." Hamish stepped aside. Suddenly he felt older, as if the warmth in the Kirk Hall had been replaced by something stagnant. Villagers avoided his eyes, ashamed yet relieved to place blame elsewhere. Jessie stood rigid, unsure whether to thank him or condemn him for the ordeal she had endured. Lugs pressed against Hamish's leg, ears flicking at the raised voices. Blair barked orders, already crafting a tale that would place him at the centre of the solution. Hamish let him. He'd fought enough battles for one night. As the crowd thinned and the cold reached in through the cracked windows, Hamish remained still, staring at the ring on the table. It gleamed faintly, a small, stubborn truth. The case should have felt solved. It didn't. Lochdu breathed around him, suspicious, wounded, and not finished with him yet. The trouble began before Hamish even reached the station door. Someone had chalked a crude drawing on the wall beside it, a lopsided figure pushing another into the loch. Underneath, in uneven letters, someone had written, "Ask the Polis." Hamish stared at it, feeling the old slump in his shoulders. Lug sniffed and let out a low, uncertain whine. The dog disliked tension, and there had been plenty of it since the case had ended. Inside, Anderson was packing up files with theatrical sighs. "Blair says we're done here," he said. "Strathbane will be issuing a final press note." Hamish grunted and pushed past him. The whole building smelled of damp wool and stale takeaway. Nothing tidy about Strathbane's work, despite their pompous tidy-up announcements. Anderson lingered, as if expecting praise for leaving. Hamish ignored him. When the door finally closed behind the man, the silence felt neither restful nor pleasant, just empty. By afternoon the reporters arrived, 2 of them, city types with the smug confidence of people who believed the world worked in neat lines. Blair strutted before them in the village street, roaring about his relentless pressure. He named Mrs. Fraser as though he had personally hunted her across mountains. Hamish's own contribution was dismissed as local assistance. Hamish watched from the side. Lug sat by his boot, tail twitching in irritation. When the reporters left, Dougie Fraser stomped toward him. The young man's face was blotched from drink or rage or both. "You could have stopped them," he growled. "Blair carted me off as if I'd drowned the man with my bare hands." Hamish said nothing. Dougie wanted an argument or an apology. Neither would do any good. "You think you're better than the rest of us," Dougie snapped when Hamish only nodded, "but you're just scared of Strathbane like the rest." Then he turned and walked away, the bitterness trailing after him like smoke. At Patel's shop the next morning, Jessie was at full volume. "If not for Jess, curry," she trilled, tapping her chest, "that murderer would still be roaming free." Mrs. Patel, stacking tins, rolled her eyes in a way only Hamish saw. Fiona stood near the crisps, filling a basket without looking at anyone. Jessie spotted Hamish and smiled a martyr's smile. "Sergeant, do tell Mrs. Patel how vital my first-footing invitation was to the case." Hamish cleared his throat. "Aye, well, things came together slowly." Jessie beamed as if he had delivered a rousing speech in her honour. "Hear that? Slowly. Which is why villagers must keep up the standards of tradition. Not everyone appreciates the importance." Nessie, lurking behind the shortbread, muttered, "Tradition near killed us." Jessie hushed her sharply. A pair of tourists wandered in, and Jessie puffed herself up, ready to retell the whole story with the flourishes of a born embellisher. Hamish escaped while she was still warming up. Outside, the air tasted of rain about to fall again. Lug sniffed a puddle with deep concentration, which was more enthusiasm than Hamish could muster for the day. Fiona caught up with him near the post office. "Bookings are coming back," she said shortly. "Folk forget." She hesitated. "But they look at me different now, as if I might be hiding something in the coal bucket." "You'll be fine soon," Hamish said. It was a useless reassurance, and both of them knew it. She gave a dry laugh. "Fine for business, maybe, but Lochdu's memory isn't as short as tourists." She walked off without waiting for a reply, shoulders tight. At the kirk on Sunday, the elders behaved with exaggerated humility, bowing their heads so piously that Hamish nearly snorted. The family who had benefited from the old land deal arrived early, sat silently, and shook hands too fervently. Gossip had softened into half-hearted sympathy, which for Lochdu meant people muttering, "Poor Jessie," only after checking who stood behind them. Some were kinder to Hamish. A crofter left a half-dozen eggs at the station door. Someone else dropped off bannocks. No notes, no explanations. Perhaps gratitude, perhaps apology. Perhaps they simply wanted the Polis to remember them fondly. The weeks slid by awkwardly. Blair took every chance to announce his triumph. Davitt sent a note so bland it made Hamish's jaw clench. "Thank you for your support," it read, as though Hamish had merely held a door open during the investigation. It was signed in the hasty scrawl of a man who wanted the whole affair forgotten. One evening, thin sunlight fading over the loch, Hamish sat by his peat fire, feeling the warmth cling to his shins while the rest of the station stayed cold. Lugs lay stretched out, paws twitching as if chasing something in his sleep. The quiet should have been pleasant. It wasn't. A sharp knock broke the half-peace. Jessie pushed in without waiting. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said. making it clear she hoped she was. She perched on the chair as though afraid it might stain her skirt. "I only came," she began, "to ensure that when strangers ask, you'll be putting the truth straight." Hamish raised an eyebrow. "Your truth, Jessie?" "The truth," she insisted. "That I, Jessie Curry, played my part. Without me, none of this would have come to light." She folded her hands primly as if concluding a sermon. "You'll tell it that way." He watched her. For a moment she seemed almost earnest, but then her gaze slid to his curtains. "These are terrible," she said. "Green makes the place look mouldy." Hamish sighed. Jessie stood, satisfied she had improved both him and the decor. "Well," she said briskly, "Lochdu should be getting back to normal. Folk need stability." She gave him a nod that might have been gratitude, might have been condescension, then swept out. When the door shut behind her, Hamish leaned back. Luggs woke, stretched, and shuffled over to rest his head on Hamish's knee. Hamish scratched the dog's ears. "Some first foot," he muttered. Outside, the village lights flickered on one by one. Lochdu would gossip, judge, forgive, and forget in its own uneven rhythm. But it had held him again, with its pettiness and loyalty tangled together like old nets. The peace that settled wasn't quite peace, but it was what Lochdu had to offer.